Say hi, everyone, and welcome to another Albany Pine Bush Science Lecture that we've kept up through thick or thin. I'm Richard Naylor from the Friends of the Pine Bush community, and we co-sponsor with Commission staff our monthly science lecture webinars. Before we start today's program, an ecological history of the Albany Pine Bush, a note about questions in next month's program. First, as questions occur to you, even though the microphones don't work, just put a chat message or a question and answer is better, a Q&A at the bottom, and we will hold those until the end unless Dylan thinks that this is something that is so burning that we better get to it right away. So she will direct all questions to the speaker at the end, and then just add them whenever you think of them. Second, our April 15th program, again at 7 p.m., will be Litter to Glitter. Not something I expected to see in the woods, but the subtitle, Unlocking the Herbaceous Potential Stored in Forest Floors. In ecosystems across Eastern North America, fire exclusion and subsequent succession into closed canopy forests has replaced the glitter of once robust and diverse layers of wildflowers and grasses with the uninterrupted dominance of dead leaves, leaf litter. So please join Dr. Andy Vander Yacht from Michigan State University, and he will be describing how canopy disturbance in fire season can be used to restore the lost herbaceous components of Eastern ecosystems. So now, on to Dylan to introduce today's program.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you everyone so much for joining tonight. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Skylar Murphy. So Skylar is originally from Chicopee, Massachusetts. Did I say that right? Or
close?
Pretty close. Well, it sounds like that anyway, like a garbanzo bean. At least I didn't call it garbanzo bean, Massachusetts. Anyway, she just recently moved, and by recently, I mean the last week, moved down to Tallahassee, Florida. But Skylar just finished her undergraduate degree, bachelor's of, I didn't ask, was it science or technology?
Science.
Bachelor's of Science from Paul Smith's College in biology. And for her senior capstone project, she chose to do an independent study. So she designed this research with some help from her advisor, Dr. Kurt Steger. And that's what she is going to be presenting on tonight. She does hope to keep working in the field of paleoecology. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Skylar, and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks. All right, let me set up the screen share. All right, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to this presentation. My name is Skylar Murphy, and this is an ecological history of the Albany Pine Bush. Now, the main focus of this study was to conduct the first directly dated ecological history of the Albany Pine Bush. What is meant by directly dated is that carbon-14 analysis was done on small sections of our sample to give a direct date estimate on that point, but we'll talk more about that later. What we don't know about the Albany Pine Bush. There is little known about the APB's long-term fire history. What we do know about the APB is it is a fire-adapted ecosystem that requires intermittent burning in order to thrive. And we also know that approximately 12,000 years ago, Glacier Lake Albany covered this landscape, and once it receded, it left the region's iconic sand dunes, giving place for pitch pine to thrive. So why study here? The Albany Pine Bush is home to one of the most imperiled ecosystems in North America, the pitch pine scrub oak community, a community largely dominated by pitch pine, dwarf chestnut oak, and bare oak. The APB is also home to many rare and endangered species. One such example of this is the Carnered blue butterfly, as pictured on the left. Its host plant is lupin, and the lupin flower heavily relies on the regular forest fires to create openings in the understory for the seeds to have enough sunlight to develop. The lupin flower is the only flower that the Carner blue butterflies lay their eggs on, and the Albany pine bush provides a safe habitat for them in an otherwise urban setting. So as far as significantly documented, the APB could be a relatively recent ecosystem, and knowing the age could aid in further studies and preservation efforts. So what is paleoecology? It's the study of microscopic fossils that can be found trapped within layers of sediment in lakes, oceans, and wetlands. As you can see here, there's a sample, there's like what an auger would look like going down through the water into the sediments below. And this is what a core would look like coming out. You can see each layer in the sediment is preserved exactly how it was. And analyzing these microfossils allows scientists to develop an understanding of an ecosystem on the scale of hundreds of years to thousands of years, rather than an average ecological study of 1 to 5 years. So as some of you may recognize, this is Neil Gifford. He is the conservation director of the Albany Pine Bush, and he's an alumni of Paul Smith's College. Without his help, we really wouldn't have been able to accomplish anything in this study. He gave myself and my mentor, Kurt, permission to sample on a protected wetland within the APB. And this wetland is one of the main study sites in this study. So what was studied? Pollen grains that were trapped within the sediments were used to infer what plants lived in the area thousands of years ago. Pollen grains, as you can see from the image, all are slightly different based on genus and even more so based on species. And you can use dichotomous keys to figure out which ones are which. And noting charcoal layers that are preserved in the sediment allow you to see fire history. Layers of charcoal represent periods of times where there were significant periods of fire. So for some context, the Albany Pine Bush is located in Albany, New York. And there were 2 study sites that were focused on here, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, and a couple miles away, Stump Pond. The Poplar Street Bog was not used directly in this study, but in the 1970s, a study was done on a pollen analysis study was done at the Poplar Street Bog, but there were no carbon-14 analyses done. So yeah, this is the wetland. It is the protected area within the APB. We took a total of 3 cores for later analysis from this site. And this is Stump Pond, located at 665 Sandy Creek Road. We took 1 core for later analysis, and this location was determined to be a potentially viable deposit via satellite images and permission to access the land and to take a sample was received from the landowner, Dr. Sergei Gorbachev. So sediment cores APB1 and APB2 were collected using a Russian peat core. And a Russian peat core can be seen in the image here. And there's another image on the following slide. It's essentially a large metal dowel with handles on one end, and the opposite end has a large flat point. And once it's inserted completely into the sediment, it's rotated and it collects a sample that can be preserved and slid up out of the dirt. And then APB 1C was collected from the basal hardpan using a soil auger. It was just a standard soil auger that was used. So this is APB 1A. This is the uppermost of the two samples. It is from the ground level to 50 centimeters below. And this photo here has a better angle of the point on it. And this is APB2, which was sampled directly next to APB1A to ensure that we got as close to the hard pan as possible. This covers 45 centimeters to 80 centimeters deep. And here you can see some really pretty charcoal layerings at the bottom of the sample. And again, this indicates an area that had a large fire in the past. And this is APB1C, which was collected using an auger. This is the topmost section, and this is the bottommost section here. It was collected from the hard pan below the wetland, so it was harder, more dense sediment that most likely was the starting period of the wetland. So again, we sampled from Stump Pond, and this sediment core was taken from 1.6 meters below the surface. And here we were hoping to collect from a sediment that would allow a record further in time to be collected because it was deeper. So pollen analysis. The images to the right represent the most common pollen grains found. This is a pinus pollen, which is pine, and these are oak pollen grains, quercus. Picea is spruce pollen, Poaceae is grass pollen, Betula is birch pollen, and Tsuga is hemlock pollen. As you can see here, they are pretty significantly different when looking at them, to touch on an earlier point of how you can tell one pollen grain from another one. And identification was done using dichotomous keys and research papers and the Global Pollen Project, which is an online research database. So before I get into the actual data on this chart, Paleo charts are multiple different charts of pollen grains. So how you would look at this is the depth goes down here, and this is the percentage of pollen grains for each pollen. So it's multiple charts of pollen in one. And you would read it as though you're looking at the core. So the top of the chart is the earliest in time. It's the newest material closest to the surface. And the bottom of the chart is the deepest material and the oldest pollen grains found in this sample. But the most important thing to note here is that pine and oak were common throughout the entirety of the first APB core, which was really exciting because this confirmed what we were hoping when we took our samples, that we can find pollen and identify it and show that the pine bush has been here for a long period of time. And again, this is reiterating that time starts at the bottom and goes up to modernity. And now throughout the second core of APB2, you can also see that pine and oak were common throughout. With this one, we were able to take carbon-14 dates. And so we know at approximately 43 centimeters deep, it was around 2,700 years old, and near 83 centimeters deep where we sampled, it's around 6,600 years old. And so we can say that These dates, along with the continued presence of pine and oak pollen, indicates that the pine bush vegetation was present in the area at least through 6,600 years ago. And this gap here in Suga pollen may seem like a little bit of an anomaly, but it's actually really exciting. This was the absence of the hemlock pollen around 5,000 years ago is a regularly documented occurrence through the Northeast. And this also suggests that the carbon-14 dating and the pollen analysis has gone correctly because they can correlate to each other. So within the hardpan, directly below the wetland, pine and oak pollen were still seen, which indicates that the pine bush vegetation was still present and that the beginning of the wetland was roughly 6,600 years ago. So when we saw this, we got really excited and thought, what if we could go even further back, which led us to the stump pond core. So analyzing the stump pond core was really exciting. We were able to see that there was still pine pollen present throughout the entirety of the core, but there's more Picea present and Quercus or oak isn't present at all, which indicates that the pine bush vegetation could not be present 10,500 years ago. And carbon-14 analysis also shows that this is around the time that glacial Lake Albany receded from the area, because glacial Lake Albany is thought to have receded around 12,000 years ago. So not only were we able to date the time this land was exposed, but we were also able to learn that the pine bush vegetation didn't start occurring for at least 2,000 years after the lake had receded. So we learned from the study that the Albany pine bush is at least 6,600 years old, and that the wetland located within the pine bush is also approximately that old. And currently, from documented research and currently from documented research and on-ground study site examinations, it appears that only 3 sites may have been preserved that could hold the history of the Albany pine bush. The Poplar Street bog, which was analyzed in 1977, was destroyed by development, leaving only 2 possible sites for studying. And unfortunately, we learned from the landowner that it was believed that Quakers partially dredged the pond. So a lot of the youngest layers of the pond are most likely missing. But it's important to note that this study was a preliminary examination of the sediments located in the Albany pine bush and stump pond. In this study, we were unable to identify the pollen to species and did not analyze charcoal layering. But now we know that the history of the pine bush preserve is in these deposits and can be further studied in the future. So some future study recommendations of the wetland would be to analyze the charcoal layers to reconstruct the fire history of the pine bush, which could lead to better fire regime management. And further studies could examine the completeness of the sediment record in Stump Pond to get a more precise date of when glacial Lake Albany could have receded. And I would like to thank everyone for coming to this presentation tonight. It was one of my first presentations. And I would like to thank Neil Gifford again for giving us permission to sample, along with Sergei Gorbachev, for giving us access to his land. And I would like to thank my mentor for all of his help throughout this entire process. and my partner, Ethan, for helping me sample and stay focused on this paper for as long as it took. And funding for the carbon-14 analysis was from the Draper Lucy Endowment.
I was still muted. Thank you very much, Skylar. We do have some questions. Feel free to type questions in the chat or the Q&A boxes. So Richard asks, are you publishing? Is there a paper coming from this?
I don't think that there's necessarily going to be a paper from it. Me and my mentor, me and Kurt have talked about it a little bit, but it hasn't come to too much yet, no.
All right. Scott and Denise ask, what caused the absence of the hemlocks 5,000 years ago? And I have that question too. Like, are there any theories why they're missing?
So I'm not entirely sure why there's no hemlocks around that time, but I don't know, Kurt, if you want to type into the chat if there's an actual answer, but I'm pretty sure that scientists still don't know what caused the great hemlock decline in the Northeast. Is that right? Yeah, it's still undetermined. It could possibly be a disease, he said, but we don't know.
Very interesting. Especially considering we've got hemlock woolly adelgid moving north, right? So we might have another big absence of it.
It was really exciting because I took that sample and then I analyzed like that sample like 5 or 6 different times to make sure it wasn't just like a fluke, and I just found no hemlock pollen. It was really cool.
Let's see. Ruth says the study area was heavily associated with Shakers. Are you sure it was Quakers who caused the damage you mentioned?
I think he said it was Quakers, but it could have been Shakers. Kurt corrected me and said, yes, it is the Shakers. That is my mistake. I'm sorry.
I don't know why you would get them mixed up.
Yeah, they used it to harvest a lot of ice, is what Dr. Gorbachev mentioned.
Oh, interesting. Jeff says, are there differences in soil types through the record, like fine sand, heavier sand, etc.?
So with sediment, it often becomes pretty compacted. So I didn't notice too much of a difference until, at least in this specific site, until we started to get closer and closer to the hard pan. As you approached the hard pan, it became sandier for sure. And then the reason why we couldn't get any further was because we hit hard sand, which is why we took the auger core at the bottom, 80 to 95 centimeters, to try to see if we could get any pollen located in there.
Can you talk about what the hard pan is?
Yeah, so the hard pan is most likely the place of origin of the wetland. It's where it's like what lays the solid groundwork for the wetland to be built off of, if that makes sense. Like under all of the lake muck, there's hard somewhere. So under the wetlands, there's also going to be something hard and concrete holding it into place. It just really depends how deep, the depth of that really depends on how quickly sedimentation rates occur and how deep and old the wetland is.
Very cool. So is all of your samples cataloged? Because you mentioned future research. Can someone go back and look at your samples to, for example, to get them down to species?
So I know Dr. Stager still has the samples at the Paul Smith College campus, and they're still all individually bagged and tagged. Yeah, they're in storage for future study.
Awesome. Yeah, because we have two types of pinus in the pine bush, and one we're working to restore, and that's Pinus rigida, the pitch pine. But Pinus strobus is the white pine, and that's the one that we kind of that can get a little weedy in the pine barrens. And so it'd be interesting to see what the difference was between those two species in particular.
Yeah, so to genera, it's pretty easy to identify the pollen grains, like once you've looked at them enough. But like I tried looking at like the understanding of getting from genera to species, and then the subtle differences are like so minute that you need pretty high powered microscopes in order to detect them, and often years and years of pollen knowledge.
Glad it's preserved for future work. Can you tell if the carbon was from a natural heavy fire or from a controlled fire?
Do you mean the charcoal?
Sorry, I think that's probably what he means. Yeah.
So I'm not too sure. I know that there are ways if you have like electron microscopes that can like measure the size of the grains of charcoal to see how far away they could have flown, and like calculating air like movement into that, but that was way beyond our scope. It said Kurt said it could also be lightning strikes or indigenous people that caused the fires as well.
Yeah, we're that's something we're interested in. We actually met with a researcher who was working around the Great Lakes, I believe, that was trying to unravel how much native peoples contributed to habitat shifts in habitat types because of using prescribed burning for forage or for prey drives. So that's really cool that you saw such clear charcoal layers in your samples.
Yeah, it was really interesting, especially near the bottom. There were large charcoal layers. You definitely have a good area if you can get them interested in studying that. When doing research, there was documentation of Native American artifacts not too far away from the study site. So that was something that we looked into a little bit.
Darwin says or asks, are there theories on how and from where plants came from that became established in the pine bush area about 2,000 years after glacial ice and glacial meltwater drained, leaving the barren lake barren, ready for planting?
I'm not 100% sure, but I would assume vegetation from, yeah, that's what I thought, Kurt. Vegetation would have migrated from the southern area of the North American continent upwards, because it would have already been established down there.
Oh, okay. All right. Larry says, the New York State Museum has done many cores and pollen analyses over the state in the late 50s and 60s. They may help with comparisons of pollen types and bands. Oh, so possibly.
Yeah, one of the study that was conducted at the Poplar Street Bog was actually conducted in a big Albany pine bush book by the New York State Museum.
Awesome.
So it did offer some comparative analysis, but no carbon-14 dates were run on it, so it wasn't that's helpful.
Steve asks, how far away could the pollen be coming from? How large of an area could be contributing the pollen that was found in the wetlands?
So pollen can obviously travel quite far, but when you're looking at samples, you're averaging them. So it wouldn't, like something that came from far away could possibly be an outlier. Like spruce and pine can come from miles away, but smaller plants like grasses are less likely to travel that far. You're also likely to see a disparity of animal pollinated plants compared to wind pollinated plants, because animal pollinated plants often aren't preserved in the record as well, because insects come and, carry the pollen away. They don't just directly fall into sediment or like standing water like a wind pollinated plant would.
Very interesting. What kinds of things impact or can affect whether or not pollen settles into one of these wetlands? Like, does precipitation or?
I'm honestly not too sure on the answer to that. I know that like wind currents play a big effect in it, and the rain and the distance that the pollen would have to travel.
Cool. Let me see if I'm missing any. Okay. Oh, I was interested. What kind of so you were focusing in these wetland habitats. The Rensselaer Lake was right there. So what kind of habitats are you looking for to get these types of samples?
So wetland habitats can often be better for collecting pollen samples versus lake habitats. Lakes often, by the time the pollen reaches the surface of the water, it would have to move through the entire water column in order to get down to the sediment. And it also has to be within the range of the Albany pine bush. So we were lucky with Stump Pond being less than a couple miles away from the pine bush.
Awesome. All right, let's see. Did I miss any? All right. I don't see any other questions. And let me see if I asked all of mine. Yeah, I think I did. Or other people asked my questions.
Kurt's asking me what my science plans are again. He does this at the end of every single one of the presentations I give. I'm still interested in pursuing higher education in paleoecology. I haven't looked into too many programs since I've been down here. I've been, getting furniture and adjusting to the heat, but I do plan to continue my education.
Yeah, it seems I mean, you seem predisposed. This was a pretty big project that you took on all by yourself. So well done.
It was a big and exciting project that had some really cool outcomes, and I hope in the future someone that is interested in the pine bush does something with the charcoal record. It would be obviously really helpful to understand the fire history of the area a bit better.
Yeah, it's something we're always trying to understand, right? We're working towards restoring this pitch pine scrub oak barrens because we know right now that that's a rare habitat type and one that can't exist in other areas. It can exist here because of the soils and the geology. So, but learning the history is such a huge part of understanding the place. Richard says, this is some really good information to show that the pine bush has such a long history.
Yeah, it's also really exciting to just be talking about paleoecology in general because it has so many applications to show the history of an area. Like you just need a wetland that has some deep enough sediments and some luck to help that the pollen was saved in there, and you can show that this vegetation has been existing in an area for a long time. It provides deeper perspectives than any normal ecological study could.
Very much. Darwin typed one. He says, where were the core samples analyzed? In the field or in lab settings?
Yeah, so it was my last semester at PSC and it was remote due to COVID. So I analyzed them with a decent sized microscope that Kurt let me borrow in my apartment.
Awesome. Did you find anything weird? Did you find any fossils or anything when you were looking through it?
I mean, I guess in theory the pollen grains are fossils. So, but no, it was exciting seeing some of the weirder things that couldn't be identified, and I found a couple pollen grains that we think could have been like in the blueberry family, which is a pretty rare find because they're animal pollinated. So that was cool.
Oh, wow. That's very cool. I didn't realize that it would be so rare to find the animal pollinated, but it makes sense. What you said makes total sense. All right. I think I've got all of the questions. So thank you again, Skylar, for your work. And thank you for taking the time to tell us about it all the way from Florida right after a move. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
And thank you guys for having me. It was a pleasure presenting this. I hope I helped teach some people about the APB and the cool field of science.
Definitely. It's a really cool field of science. And always super cool to learn more about the pine bush. You're getting lots of kudos in that chat box. So make sure you check them out before you leave.
Well, thank you guys.